Hero or mere invention of the Middle Ages? What if King Arthur really existed? Welcome to Collapse, where history comes to life, and each video immerses you in the destinies of those who have shaped the world. Today, prepare to step through the veil of time and follow in the footsteps of King Arthur, the legendary ruler who is said to have united the people of Britain and defied the darkness. From the misty moors of Wales to the golden halls of Camelot, his name resonates like an echo from a lost golden age. Amidst the clash of battles and the wisdom of the ancients, his destiny was forged in the fire of legend. King by the sword, guide by the heart, he embodied the hope of a people in search of unity. For centuries, the legend has fascinated. But what does it really hide? But before embarking on a new adventure, don't forget to like the video and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss anything. Thank you, and bon voyage. At the turn of the 5th century, Anno Domini, Europe was experiencing a period of unprecedented change. At this time, the Western world was undergoing political, cultural, and military reorganization. The stories that bring forth the figure of King Arthur are situated precisely in this turbulent context, at the moment when the Western Roman Empire crumbled to give way to new powers. It is crucial to place the Arthurian myth in the general picture of global upheavals before explaining why this character, half historical, half legendary, has left such a lasting impression. At the beginning of the 5th century, the Roman Empire, divided between East and West, was already weakened by internal crises and external pressures. In its western part, the authority of Rome was faltering and could no longer effectively manage its vast territories. The reasons were multiple: economic collapse, drastic drops in tax revenues, political instability due to military rivalries, and increasingly frequent invasions by peoples from beyond the imperial borders. The year 476 is traditionally considered the endpoint of the Western Roman Empire. That year, the Germanic leader Odoacer deposed the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus. There was then no true Roman authority left in Western Europe. The Western provinces, once subject to Roman power, were thus left to themselves or administered by local military leaders. Roman infrastructure persisted for some time, but they often ended up deteriorating due to a lack of means for maintenance. State services, which managed the organization of civilian and military life, unraveled. Roads, aqueducts, and fortified cities no longer received the same attention, although some continued to function partially or under new masters. In this context of political disintegration, former Roman generals and various barbarian kings fought over the remnants of the West. Alliances were quickly made and broken, drawing a political map in constant evolution. For many peoples living in Europe, the fall of the Western Roman Empire was less of a sudden catastrophe than a long and gradual mutation. However, in the medieval collective imagination, this fall corresponded to a dark rupture. It was the supposed end of a civilized era and the entrance into a darker age, conducive to the emergence of legendary tales. With the political vacuum left by Rome, a series of kingdoms, then referred to as barbarians, arose or expanded. The term barbarian was what the Romans used to describe non-Romanized peoples, often of Germanic culture. It did not necessarily reflect a lack of civilization, but summarized a Roman view of entities perceived as external and sometimes threatening. The Vandals, a Germanic people, crossed Gaul, present-day France and Hispania, present-day Spain, and eventually settled in North Africa, conquering key former Roman provinces. From Carthage, they even launched maritime raids against Rome and other coastal regions of the Mediterranean. The Visigoths, initially federated with the Roman Empire, captured large portions of southern Gaul and Hispania, forming an important kingdom with Toulouse as a major political center, and later, Toledo. This Visigothic kingdom endured for several centuries, developing its own institutions and a certain level of culture. The Ostrogoths, closely related to the Visigoths, moved towards Italy. Under the reign of their king, Theodoric the Great, they attempted to partially restore the Roman legacy, maintaining administrative structures inherited from the imperial era. Italy thus became the heart of an Ostrogothic kingdom, with Ravenna as the center of power. The Franks, led by the famous Clovis, began their expansion towards the end of the 5th century. Clovis, king of the Salian Franks, converted to Catholic Christianity around 496, an act of considerable symbolic and political importance. He thereby laid the foundations of a new dynasty, the Merovingians. Under the impetus of Clovis and his successors, the Frankish kingdom expanded and eventually encompassed most of Gaul, laying the groundwork for what would later become France. While the Western Roman Empire faded, the Eastern Roman Empire survived and continued on a distinct evolutionary path. This empire gradually became known as the Byzantine Empire in modern historiography, even though its inhabitants still considered themselves Romans and mostly spoke Greek. Its capital, Constantinople, now Istanbul, was a strategic hub, solidly fortified. It controlled the passages between the Mediterranean and the Black Sea, making it a prosperous trade crossroads. Under the reign of Justinian, between 527 and 565, the eastern part of the empire experienced a remarkable revival. Justinian dreamed of restoring Roman greatness and launched military campaigns to reconquer some western regions that had fallen under barbarian control. His armies, led by the famous general Belisarius, retook North Africa from the Vandals and parts of Italy from the Ostrogoths, attempting to recreate a unified Mediterranean space. At the same time, Justinian also codified Roman law in a monumental collection, the Corpus Juris Civilis, which would have a lasting influence on European legislations. On the religious front, the Byzantine Empire presented itself as the defender of nascent Orthodox Christianity. Faced with theological divisions, particularly around the nature of Christ, disputes between Monophysites, Nestorians, and Chalcedonians, tensions arose with the Western Church. Although it was still too early to speak of an official schism, differences in practices and sensibilities were already noticeable. The Eastern Patriarchs and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, found it increasingly difficult to agree, paving the way for future conflicts. Beyond the European and Mediterranean space, other great civilizations also experienced significant developments. It is important to mention them for a comprehensive view of the world at the time when Arthurian stories emerged. Even if these cultural spheres did not always interact directly with insular Britain, their dynamism indicates a world in motion. In China, the 5th and 6th centuries saw various dynasties succeed each other. During the first half of the 5th century, the Northern Wei dynasty dominated a large part of northern China, while the south was controlled by other kingdoms. Later, at the end of the 6th century, the Sui dynasty managed to unify China for a short period, laying the foundations for an imperial renewal that would culminate under the Tang dynasty. Although geographically distant from Western European affairs, the Chinese dynasties maintained contacts, particularly via the Silk Road, with diverse regions, thus participating in significant cultural and commercial exchanges. In India, the Gupta Empire, which had experienced a golden age of culture and sciences, began to decline towards the end of the 5th century. Repeated invasions by peoples coming from the northwest, such as the Hephthalites Huns, destabilized the Gupta power and fragmented the subcontinent into several independent kingdoms. Despite this political fragmentation, intellectual and artistic life continued in various Indian urban centers, maintaining a wealth of philosophical and religious schools between Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. In pre-Columbian America, though unknown to the Old World, brilliant civilizations were already developing. The Maya in Mesoamerica, present-day southern Mexico, Guatemala, Honduras, built independent city-states, each with palaces, pyramids, and remarkable astronomical observatories. Their hieroglyphic writing and advancements in mathematics or calendrical systems were particularly sophisticated. Further south, in what is now Peru, the Nazca culture thrived, famous for its gigantic geoglyphs drawn in the desert. All these civilizations evolved according to their own dynamics and did not yet intersect with the European sphere. To understand the conditions under which the legend of Arthur was born, one must look closely at what was happening on the island of Britain, called Britannia, during Roman times. The Roman legions, stationed for centuries, gradually withdrew. In theory, this withdrawal began as early as the beginning of the 5th century, when Rome could no longer allocate enough troops to defend the island's borders. The Roman administration had begun to disintegrate, military presence waned, cities were less well defended, and the administrative link with the continent gradually severed. With the end of Roman tutelage, the local populations, a mix of Romanized Celts and Britons, or Brito-Romans, found themselves unprotected against external raids. It was in this context that the arrival of the Saxon, Angel, and Juti peoples occurred, coming from regions roughly corresponding to present-day northern Germany and Denmark. Over the course of the 5th century, these groups settled on the eastern coast of Great Britain and began to move inland. Historians often speak of first invasions by Saxons, Angles, and Jutes, but it was more of a slow colonization, punctuated by battles, alliances, settlements, and subsequent betrayals. In response to these pressures, various Brito-Roman communities and Celtic tribes organized to resist or negotiate. Written sources are sparse and fragmentary, but it is known that multiple small kingdoms emerged, sometimes temporarily uniting their forces to fend off invaders, sometimes quarreling among themselves for control of different regions. The Kingdom of Dumnonia in the southwest, or Powys and Gwynedd in present-day Wales, are sometimes mentioned. Some leaders, with Roman military backgrounds, sought to preserve the infrastructures and administrative models inherited from the empire, while others emphasized their Celtic roots, valuing Brittonic culture and language. This fragmented panorama placed Great Britain on a chaotic trajectory, broken into countless political entities. Later, chronicles depict incessant struggles. In this troubled climate, a captain or king capable of rallying different factions and standing up to the Saxons would have captured everyone's imagination. This is probably one of the roots of the Arthurian myth, the figure of an ideal British leader who for a time saved the island from chaos, or at least created a surge of patriotism. Amidst these upheavals, the legend of Arthur unfolds in the British and later European collective imagination. The first question modern historians ask is, did Arthur really exist? Opinions remain divided. Some specialists believe he may have been a Brito-Roman warlord who lived during the first half of the 6th century and briefly united the Breton resistance against the Anglo-Saxon invaders. Others argue that he is a purely legendary figure, a symbol of Celtic resistance, or an amalgamation of several historical leaders whose memories were gathered under one name. first mentions of Arthur, or a character resembling that name, appear in British texts from the early Middle Ages. Among the sources, Gildas, a 6th century monk who wrote a treatise titled De Excidio e Conquestu Britanniae, is often cited. Gildas denounces the corruption and sins of the leaders of his time, seeking less to write a faithful chronicle than to formulate a moral and religious plea. Although he does not explicitly name Arthur, he does mention confrontations against the Saxons, which can fit within the broader historical framework where the Arthurian legend later develops. Nennius, a Welsh chronicler of the 9th century, is one of the first to explicitly mention the name Arthur in his Historia Brittonum. In this account, Arthur appears as a dux bellorum, war leader, a lieutenant of Breton kings or a leader in his own right, victor of 12 battles against the Saxons. Although these victories are difficult to pinpoint precisely, they suggest the existence of a central figure leading an energetic resistance. However, the true rise of the Arthurian legend occurs in the 12th century, thanks to the pen of Geoffrey of Monmouth. In his work, Historia Regum Britannia, completed around 1138, Geoffrey paints a grand portrait of Arthur, King of Britain, conqueror of Ireland and Gaul, almost equal to the Roman emperors. He introduces elements that will durably influence the legend, such as the major role of the magician Merlin, Arthur's nobility, his dazzling victories, and the charm of the Arthurian court. As a work partly of propaganda, the Historia Regum Britanniae seeks to highlight the supposed grandeur of the British lineage in the face of the Norman domination in place at the time, while skillfully blending historical facts and Celtic folklore. It is on this basis that the Arthurian cycle is built, enriched by later authors, notably in France and Germany. We think of Chrétien de Troyes, who introduces the quest for the Grail and solidifies the concept of the Round Table, or Wolfram von Eschenbach, who develops the figure of Percival. The Arthurian myth then finds a literary and symbolic momentum that transcends the strictly historical framework and takes the characters of Arthur, Lancelot, Gawain, or Merlin to the aristocratic courts of Europe. For all that, this literary aura should not obscure the fact that behind every legend, there could exist a historical substratum. The mention of Gildas and then Nennius is proof of an ancient grounding of the memory of a warrior chief. This figure, who becomes Arthur, possibly merges with the nostalgia for a more unified British resistance. In a medieval world in search of heroes and symbols, this story becomes the support of chivalric virtues, marvelous tales, and a cultural identity. At the turn of the 5th century, Brittany, the medieval term for the island of Great Britain, is undergoing a period of profound upheavals. Since the early 400s, the Roman Empire, which had dominated the province of Britannia since the 1st century Anno Domini, is gradually withdrawing from the island. Around 410, Emperor Honorius sends a missive to the cities of Brittany, inviting them to ensure their own defense. This date marks a turning point. The Roman administration, with its political and military structures, disintegrates while local residents begin to organize themselves autonomously. The absence of central governance then favors the emergence of small entities led by local leaders whom we can call petty kings or Breton princes. At the same time, former Romano-British notables, sometimes trained in Roman military arts, attempt to maintain a semblance of order. However, the situation quickly becomes complicated. Germanic peoples, notably the Angles, Saxons, and Jutes, land on the island's eastern coast to settle or conclude military alliances with local authorities. Initially, some Breton kings employ these warriors as mercenaries to defend against other rival clans. But gradually, these populations establish themselves permanently, claiming territories and challenging the authority of the Breton leaders. Amidst the notable figures of this chaotic era, there is King Vortigern. Medieval chronicles, such as the Historia Brittonum, attributed to Nennius, probably written in the 9th century, describe him as a character who sought the alliance of Saxons to strengthen his power. According to these later accounts, Vortigern invited Saxon chiefs, notably Hengist and Horsa, to settle in Kent, a region located in the southeast of present-day England. According to legend, this initiative caused growing tensions between the native Celts and the new arrivals. Against a backdrop of political maneuvering, Vortigern's personality appears controversial. Some portray him as a traitor responsible for the Saxon invasion, others as a leader desperately seeking balance among various local powers. In this fragmented context, Breton warlords attempt to organize themselves to halt the Saxon advance. Among those who distinguished themselves during the post-Roman transition, the figure of Uther Pendragon is sometimes mentioned, whose actual existence is subject to debate. The nickname Pendragon could derive from the Welsh pen, meaning head or chief, and dragon, symbolizing both warrior bravery and a strong Celtic emblem. Although the information on Uther remains uncertain, medieval tradition depicts him as a military lord, even a king, ruling over a vast territory in the west of the island. He would oppose Vortigern's weaknesses and reinforce through his alliances the bulwark against Saxon advances. The main mission of these Breton chiefs is to protect their domains, sometimes caught between multiple fronts. On one side, the invaders from Germania; on the other, the internal struggles for supremacy over the island. In this political labyrinth, loyalty fluctuates. Agreements are broken as quickly as they are formed, and the absence of a unified state structure fosters perpetual conflicts. Yet it is within this uncertain framework that the legend of Arthur, future king or main warlord, according to the versions, will be born and grow. Talking about Uther Pendragon first means distinguishing what belongs to myth and what to history. The earliest references to Uther appear in Nennius, and especially in Geoffrey of Monmouth in the 12th century, in his work Historia Regum Britannia. Modern scholars cautiously discuss medieval sources as they mix legendary anecdotes with possible factual data. Despite this, a historical core might exist, an important warlord standing up to Saxon raids in the 5th century or early 6th century. The origin of the name Pendragon also arouses various comments. Some historians see it as an honorary title, highlighting a status of supreme commander. Others suggest it is rather a poetic nickname, forged in the Celtic tradition to exalt courage. The most well-known legend claims that Uther fell in love with Ygerne, sometimes spelled Igraine, the wife of the Duke of Cornwall, by forging a pact with the advisor and enchanter Merlin. The latter, presented as a half-druid, half-Christian prophet character, allegedly offered his services to Uther to enter the castle of Tintagel. Under the effect of an illusion, Uther supposedly took on the appearance of the Duke of Cornwall, thus allowing the conception of Arthur. This story, reported by texts from the Central Middle Ages, immediately highlights the supernatural aspects surrounding the future king's birth. Arthur would be born of a union arranged by magic and destined to accomplish a grand mission. While this plot is clearly of the marvelous kind, it nevertheless reflects the complex alliances of Breton elites. Political marriages were frequent and could serve to consolidate the legitimacy of a lineage or authority over a territory. Tintagel Castle, located on the north coast of Cornwall, is even considered an archaeological site of interest. Remains of constructions from the post-Roman era have been discovered there, which fuels the idea that an influential figure might have resided there, whether called Uther or not. Historians do not rule out the possibility that this legendary tale finds an echo in genuine local power struggles, while being amplified by oral tradition and by medieval imagination. The character of Merlin plays a decisive role in the survival of the newborn Arthur. According to mythology, Uther had promised Merlin he would entrust the child to him to keep him away from intrigues that might cost him his life. In a still unstable kingdom, where political assassination is not uncommon, where alliances change suddenly, and where the notion of a legitimate heir remains fragile, the idea of hiding the royal child makes perfect sense. Merlin, described as a strategist, a wise advisor, but also a man with supernatural abilities, saw in Arthur the saving potential for the entire island. He would have ensured that the child grew up safely, away from the court's desires and machinations. On the other hand, historical sources are lacking to confirm these events. The motifs of miraculous birth and protection granted by a magical mentor are found in many heroic traditions. Some experts interpret this narrative as a literary device aimed at endowing the future leader with an extraordinary aura. In any case, this version has lastingly influenced Western culture and nourished the collective imagination. King Arthur is not an ordinary prince. He is the product of a destiny prepared in the shadows, alongside a mysterious father and a master with uncertain powers. The legend thus recounts that after his birth, Arthur is secretly entrusted to a knight named Antor, who raises him as his own son. Merlin, aware of the political dangers, deemed it more prudent to keep Arthur away from Uther's court intrigues. No symbol, no external sign should betray the young boy's true lineage. In these tales, Arthur's youth remains discreet and peaceful, marked by noble education in an adoptive home. Under Merlin's supervision, he learns the art of chivalry, weapon handling, and the principles of honor cherished in the Celtic world, imbued with oral traditions and Roman influences still visible in the local aristocratic culture. This secret education aims to prepare him for a greater role, that of a potential successor to Uther Pendragon, or a war leader capable of uniting the Britons. The stakes are high. If Arthur is not ready to defend his heritage, internal and external adversaries could seize power. The Saxons, whose settlements in the east of the island are expanding, threaten the balance of territories controlled by the Britons. Additionally, family rivalries and desires for revenge following tribal conflicts make the position of an official heir precarious. In some versions of the legend, possible half-brothers or sisters are already plotting to seize the crown. This includes Morgana, a key character who will later embody both the family bond and the contestation of Arthur's choices. Throughout his childhood, Arthur sometimes ignores the identity of his real parents, still according to the legendary accounts. This intentional ignorance shields him from the demands and hassles of the court. He thus grows up in relative humility. Whether it's helping him gain self-control or teaching him the sense of justice, this environment offers him a comprehensive and discreet learning experience. The legends emphasize the tutelary figure of Merlin, described as a wise being and prophet who supposedly had visions of the kingdom's tragic future if Arthur were not properly trained. In some authors' works, Merlin is portrayed less as a magician than as a wise advisor, heir to druidic knowledge or even Christian-inspired, who must reconcile with residual pagan traditions and the new dominant faith. As for the hypothesis that Arthur might have taken on a military role very early, it is part of the discussions among historians. Some suggest that if Arthur truly existed as a war leader, he could have been active as early as the late teens, at the age of 15 or 16. At that time, the notion of legal age differs from our current standards. Young nobles could lead a troop of warriors due to their lineage and martial training. In Celtic and Romano-British culture, being a skilled fighter ensured prestige and recognition. Persistent conflicts demanded dynamic leaders capable of quickly rallying allies around shared values, such as the protection of ancestral lands, the defense of the nascent faith, or family honor. From a more skeptical perspective, some academics argue that the figure of a young Arthur warlord might be a later embellishment of oral tradition, intended to highlight the exceptional character of the hero. It is not uncommon, indeed, for epic literature to endow its protagonist with supernatural abilities or precocious talents to make him an extraordinary character. Thus, the portrait of a young boy standing up to experienced lords serves the myth more than historical documentation. Yet, given the realities of the 5th century, the idea is not entirely implausible. The path of arms was a probable destiny for an heir determined to reconquer a fragmented territory, especially in a society where proving military value could outweigh mere legitimacy by blood. Regardless of the versions, Arthur's adolescent phase remains shrouded in mystery. Most medieval texts quickly gloss over the details, preferring to stage the famous sword trial, the moment when Arthur's destiny is revealed. However, when placed in a historical context, it is logical to imagine that Arthur, or whoever might have inspired this character, had to assert his authority within a divided court after the death of Uther Pendragon, or the collapse of his power. This involved defeating potential rivals, negotiating alliances, and relying on family support or loyalists rallied by the promise of booty and stability. Arthur, or his historical equivalent, also had to capitalize on the prestige of still lively Roman traditions, such as wearing the toga in certain rituals or using Latin titles to reinforce his credibility. It is worth remembering that this period, sometimes called the Dark Ages by some historians of the past, is so named not because it was necessarily dark or barbaric, but because written sources are very limited. Archaeology is gradually shedding light on social organization, migrations, and fortifications, but the results lack precision. The Arthurian legends, for their part, flourished mainly from the 12th century and were regularly enriched with poetic, religious, or symbolic details, without always faithfully corresponding to the authentic facts of the 5th and 6th centuries. However, they inform us about how medieval peoples perceived their past and sought a unifying hero to embody the lost unity. At the heart of the traditions linked to Arthur, the scene where a young man of seemingly ordinary appearance pulls a sword embedded in a block of stone remains one of the most evocative moments. This image, made famous through literature, iconography, and later cinema, symbolizes both Arthur's exceptional destiny and the assertion of a kingship founded on a divine or magical sign. It is essential to understand the symbolic significance of this gesture. In many Western European cultures, the legitimation of a sovereign was often accompanied by an initiatory act or trial whose outcome proved the supernatural election of the king. According to the most widespread variant in British folklore, the sword stood long in the stone, defying all noble knights who tried to extract it. Counts, dukes, and princes had attempted in vain. Some later texts suggest that this sword mysteriously appeared in the heart of London, sometimes associated with an inscription proclaiming that only the true king, chosen by providence or divine will, could seize it. This decisive moment, during which the young Arthur modestly advances and succeeds in the trial, reverses the established order. The powerful barons and warlords, who initially regarded him as a mere boy, find themselves confused, forced to acknowledge the authenticity of his power. This legendary scene, often likened to the discovery of the sword Excalibur, nonetheless carries some nuances. Indeed, in popular imagination, we very frequently equate the sword from the stone and Excalibur as one and the same object. However, several medieval texts clearly distinguish between the two weapons. The first, the sword in the stone, serves to legitimize Arthur as king, while the second, Excalibur, is given to him later by a fairy entity called the Lady of the Lake. This difference is not trivial. It reflects the richness of the sources and the evolution of the myth over the centuries. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in the 12th century, who wrote his Historia Regum Britannia, does not yet give much importance to the Lady of the Lake. It is only in later narratives, like those of Chrétien de Troyes, that this supernatural figure gains in significance. Once his royal calling is recognized by the sword in the stone, or at least his legitimacy in the eyes of many barons, Arthur must prove on the battlefield that he is not only a king by right, but also a king in practice. The period during which his first military campaigns would have occurred generally spans the latter half of the 5th century, or the early 6th. According to tradition, Arthur's early battles are thus primarily about pushing back the advancing Saxons, who threaten the fragile balance of the British realms. Later, historians, drawing inspiration from older sources or oral legends, mention battle names that now form part of folklore. For example, the Battle of Badon Hill, often cited as the decisive confrontation that supposedly allowed Arthur to repel the invaders. Although the precise location of Badon Hill remains uncertain, several hypotheses place this battlefield in southern England or in the region of Wales, one of the historical areas where the Romano-Britannic influence still seemed strong. During these conflicts, Arthur would have benefited from the support of different groups. On one hand, a section of the Breton nobility, seeking to preserve its interests, saw in him a providential champion capable of defending their lands against the Saxon grasp. On the other hand, the Welsh nobility, itself descended from ancient Celtic dynasties, may have found in the common threat a reason to ally with the newly proclaimed king. In some later Welsh tales, Arthur is even depicted more as a warlord than a monarch in the strict sense, rallying under his banner a heterogeneous army of followers, composed of knights from Romanized families, Celtic warriors, and even, according to some speculations, cohorts still structured according to the old Roman model. To unify such diverse forces, not only a charismatic leader was needed, but also a shrewd strategist. The alliances forged by Arthur demonstrate an acute sense of military diplomacy, allying with rival clans, granting privileges to certain barons to ensure their loyalty, organizing swift campaigns to surprise the enemy. The legend later would adorn these feats of arms by presenting Arthur as invincible and almost supernatural. However, realistically speaking, if a leader of the 5th or 6th century managed to secure several successive victories against the Saxons, he would gain prestige and power. This accumulation of triumphs, whether historical or partially mythified, explains why Arthur quickly became solidified in the imagination of the populations as the ultimate defender of the Breton land. As time passes, the figure of Arthur is no longer just that of an itinerant warlord traversing lands and battlefields. Growing in power implied establishing a stronghold, a center of command, a symbol of the emerging kingdom's unity. This is why tradition places the foundation of Camelot, the legendary city associated with Arthurian authority. For many, Camelot embodies, in medieval literature, the quintessence of enlightened royalty, an imposing castle surrounded by ramparts with a brilliant court marked by justice, bravery, and, later on, the famous Round Table. Some scholars believed they recognized it in the fortress of Cadbury Castle, in Somerset, in the southwest of England. Other sources mention Caerleon in Wales, an ancient Roman camp where amphitheaters and solid walls still stood in the 5th century. Others have argued that Winchester in the county of Hampshire, later fortified and endowed with a great hall, could have passed for the historical Camelot. This confusion is partly explained by the medieval habit of associating Arthur with major centers of power. In later tales, Camelot becomes an ideal location, almost beyond time and space, a symbol of the perfect court. But if we place ourselves at the beginning of the 6th century, the original Camelot might have simply been a well-defended site, strategically positioned and equipped with infrastructures inherited from Rome, which would have offered Arthur the advantage of establishing himself there durably. Culturally, the foundation of such a seat calls for several comments. On one hand, it shows that Arthur aspired to establish not only military domination, but also an organized political authority. To manage a territory in full transformation, a central administrative hub was needed where taxes could be collected, emissaries received, disputes arbitrated, and reserves stored. On the other hand, Camelot, even though shrouded in legend, crystallizes the idea that a strong monarchy emerges in the western part of Great Britain, able to counter the growing Saxon settlements to the east. Much later, medieval writers would embroider around the image of an idealized city, endowed with large halls decorated with tapestries, a sumptuous chapel, and a drawbridge constantly guarded by intrepid knights. They would insist on the moral grandeur of Arthur's court, intended to represent a model of honor and chivalry. But at the stage of Arthur's rise, the key element remains this tangible need to establish a central bastion, to cement his authority and affirm his new royal status. The final step in this progression from the trial of the sword and the stone to the establishment of legitimate power is Arthur's coronation. Medieval accounts often describe the ceremony in grandiose terms, blending Christian elements with older Celtic traditions. It's said that barons and nobles, once wary, now recognize Arthur's worth and gather at Camelot, or sometimes Caerleon, to witness his enthronement. Clergy lend their services, reciting consecration prayers, and thus imparting a sacred dimension to the event, while in some tales, typically Celtic gestures or symbols are mentioned. One of these symbols could be, for instance, the wearing of a torque, an emblematic necklace within various Celtic populations, or the presence of mythicized druids. Although these elements are subject to debate regarding their historical accuracy, they emphasize the notion that Arthur embodies a bridge between the ancient Celtic world and the new Christianized era. Merlin, the enigmatic enchanter, frequently plays a decisive role in this coronation. In some versions, he presents himself as the guarantor of Arthur's authenticity, claiming to have witnessed the extraordinary circumstances of his birth and the proclamation of his destiny. He is also said to be the inspirer of the sword in the stone trial, or even the mediator between the divine plan and the world of men. Thus, by endorsing Arthur's ascent to the throne, Merlin legitimizes the choice of heaven, establishing himself as the young sovereign's principal advisor. In medieval culture, This mage prophet figure perfectly illustrates the fascination born from the convergence between Celtic tradition, where Druidic sages held a privileged place, and Christianity, with the biblical notion of prophecy. Numerous manuscripts place Merlin alongside Arthur, urging his piety and encouraging him to dispense justice fairly, to better unite the peoples present on the island. From a more historical perspective, it is useful to examine how a successful warlord could be crowned king in post-Roman Britain. The official coronation rites, modeled on those of the Western Roman Empire, no longer really existed, and the Bishop of Rome, the Pope, did not then exercise the same authority as in the Central Middle Ages. The Christian communities of England, Ireland, or Wales were not uniform, and some were still heavily tinged with local traditions. It is therefore likely that, to give a solemn veneer to Arthur's elevation, a combination of practices inherited from the Roman presence, such as formal recognition by the country's elite, with a religious ornament, entrusted to a high ecclesiastical dignitary, and an older ceremonial inherited from the Celtic kings, which sometimes consisted of an oath on sacred ground or the taking of a symbolic seat of investiture. The barons surrounding Arthur see themselves, in later texts, as companions having fought alongside him and having faith in his qualities. Each of these lords brings his seal of approval, certain that Arthur's military success gives him the stature to reign, and above all, to govern in the common interest. The ceremony, in the legendary account, seals Arthur's transition from battle hero to legitimate king. Symbolically, everything holds together. The hidden child, who has grown and proved his courage in many battles, now transforms into a protector of the laws and guarantor of civil peace. Without the support of these barons, however, Arthur would not have succeeded in establishing order. His coronation is part of the necessity to rally multiple clans and major families of the country, each carrying an ancient heritage, regional alliances, and their own ambitions. Later chronicles, whether fictional or inspired by older documents, often emphasize a certain miraculous dimension during the coronation. For instance, they describe a suddenly clear sky during a storm, or a song of birds that would come at just the right time to crown the praises of the faithful. It is, of course, delicate to distinguish purely literary contributions from possible historical truth. Nevertheless, this sacralization of Arthur remains a fundamental pivot. It means that his power is no longer contested, and that the king's strength no longer stems solely from his martial prowess, but also from the almost unanimous recognition that he embodies an ideal. From then on, Arthur is no longer just a unifier through violence. He becomes the legitimate protector of a people. At the heart of King Arthur's legendary reign lies an institution that forever marked the collective imagination, the community of the Knights of the Round Table. It is important to understand how much this fellowship of elite warriors symbolizes, in medieval tradition, the pinnacle of chivalry and justice. Originally, chivalry was a code of conduct for mounted warriors, gradually emerging in Western Europe between the 5th and 12th centuries, a period corresponding to the political reconfiguration that followed the fall of the Western Roman Empire. Arthur's Knights of the Round Table embody this code in an ideal manner, personifying values as varied as courage, loyalty, courtesy, and a sense of duty to the kingdom. The idea of the Round Table, in a literary and epic sense, truly takes shape in the writings of several medieval authors, among whom are Chrétien de Troyes, active in the second half of the 12th century, and the authors of the Vulgate Cycle, a set of French texts from the 13th century. Chrétien de Troyes, notably, is one of the first to depict knights gathered around a table where no one can claim the place of honor, as all are considered equal in their quest for chivalric ideals. This notion of almost fraternal equality was an innovation for the time, as medieval society was highly hierarchical. The Round Table proposed a more harmonious model, where each participant is free to express themselves without any marked precedence. Among the main knights of the Round Table, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, Bors, and Kay are often mentioned. Each possesses particular character traits and backgrounds. In most texts, Lancelot du Lac appears as the most accomplished in martial terms, demonstrating incomparable military prowess. However, his complex personality arises from the inner conflict between his clandestine love for Queen Guinevere and his loyalty to King Arthur. Gawain, Arthur's nephew in several versions, represents bravery and family spirit. He is distinguished by his strong attachment to honor and his keen sense of duty. Percival, for his part, is often described as the innocent or naive. He sets out on adventures driven by unwavering faith and a desire to understand the world, leading him to play a key role in the quest for the Holy Grail. Bors, more discreet in some stories, is nevertheless a knight with a big heart, known for his chastity and piety. Kay, sometimes designated as Arthur's seneschal, is noted for his rough and ironic temperament, but remains loyal to the king and the court. These knights, despite their differences, form a group united by a common ideal: to defend Camelot and the kingdom, rescue the oppressed, and meet the demands of chivalric honor. In medieval French, English, and more broadly Western culture, this core of elite knights was constantly revisited and reinterpreted to the point of becoming, for many, the model of ideal brotherhood. The influence of Christianity, already very strong at the time these legends were written, is felt in the emphasis on morality and purity of heart required to carry out the greatest spiritual endeavors. Thus, courage is not only military, it also consists of leading a healthy, pious life aligned with the principles of faith. This aspiration to perfection, in the broad sense, explains the continued fascination with the Arthurian legend today. To fully grasp the significance of the Round Table, one must return to the idea of the chivalric cenacle, a concept found in several medieval texts. This table without head or foot, whose circular shape allows all those seated to look each other in the eye, symbolizes the equity, mutual trust, and male camaraderie that Arthur intended to promote within his kingdom. In the stories, the king establishes this form of council to ensure that no knight feels wronged by a privilege granted to another. At a time marked by the multiplicity of lordships, where precedency conflicts could escalate into feudal wars, this preventive arrangement appears as the ideal instrument for maintaining group cohesion and avoiding destructive jealousies. According to some hypotheses put forward to explain the real foundations of the legend, the Round Table could have been inspired by Breton war councils that brought together local notables to debate military strategy. In a context where the Saxon threat weighed heavily in the 5th and 6th centuries, this practice could have been notably effective for making collegial decisions. Historical sources are scarce and sometimes contradictory, but they suggest that Breton leaders needed to collaborate closely to contain external aggressions. From there, to identify one of these assemblies with the Round Table described in literary texts is just a step, often taken by myth specialists seeking points of convergence between medieval romance and post-Roman reality. Over time, especially from the 12th century onward, the Round Table became a rich literary motif. Arthurian romances emphasized the idealized dimension of this institution. Everyone debates on an equal footing, regardless of birth rank or the seniority of titles, at least in theory. In legendary practice, Arthur retains the ultimate authority, but he views his knights as equals, sharing with them responsibilities and honors. This image of a harmonious society profoundly influenced the vision of royal power in the West, nourishing a political ideal where the king was to rule in constant dialogue with his best warriors and advisors. Among the countless feats attributed to the Knights of the Round Table, the quest for the Holy Grail remains one of the most significant and mystically charged episodes. The Grail is traditionally described as a sacred object linked to the Passion of Christ. Some texts associate it with the Holy Chalice, containing the blood of Christ, while others see it as a dish or container used during the Last Supper. Chrétien de Troyes, in his novel Percival, the Story of the Grail, circa 1180, is the first to give form to this concept, although he does not complete his story. Soon after, the Arthurian Vulgate, a collection of 13th century texts, develops this idea into a complex cycle where the Grail becomes the ultimate goal of knighthood, the spiritual treasure said to bring the remission of all ills. This quest has a strong religious dimension. To hope to reach the Grail, one must be morally impeccable. Only the purest knights can truly approach and behold it, hence the importance of characters like Galahad, often described as the son of Lancelot in the French tradition. Galahad is renowned for his perfect purity, which allows him to succeed where others fail. Percival, whose naivety sometimes borders on sanctity, also stands out as an essential protagonist. Lancelot, despite his immense bravery, is hindered by his forbidden love for Queen Guinevere, which he cannot renounce, and which prevents him from achieving the required perfection. The noteworthy episodes of the Grail quest are many, but one particularly grabs attention: the visit to the castle of the Fisher King. In some versions, this character, the Grail's guardian, suffers from an incurable wound that affects not only himself, but the entire surrounding kingdom, plunged into desolation. Only the right question from Percival or another worthy knight can break the curse, illustrating that bravery alone is not enough. One must also show empathy and spiritual understanding. The Grail, sometimes appearing levitating or bathed in supernatural light during these scenes, underscores the extraordinary nature of the adventure. It transcends mere martial prowess to venture into the realm of the sacred. Thanks to numerous battles and the bravery of his knights, Arthur's reign is described in the legendary tradition as marking a golden age for the court of Camelot, and more broadly, for the lands under the king's authority. This period of peace, sometimes idealized in the texts, sees the peak of wealth and splendor of a court renowned throughout medieval Western Europe, at least as conceived by the authors. In the spirit of Arthurian tales, Camelot becomes a center not only political but also cultural, cultivating the art of poetry, music, and refined politeness. During this phase deemed perfect, Arthur organizes tournaments and jousts to preserve the vigor and competitive spirit of his knights. These festivities constitute major public events. They allow warriors to train while providing inhabitants with spectacular entertainment. Troubadours, itinerant poets, take advantage of these gatherings to sing the praises of the king and his vassals, reinforcing the notion that Camelot sits at the height of glory and refinement. Some texts even suggest that all the courts of Europe envied Arthur's at this time, seeing him as an exemplary monarch embodying both military strength, justice, and courtesy. The very nature of this legendary prosperity still raises questions among contemporary historians. Historically, it is observed that, in post-Roman Britain, some warlords managed to maintain relative security in certain regions despite Saxon invasions. The memory of an especially effective leader might have inspired the idea of a stable and flourishing kingdom under the banner of a charismatic leader. Later accounts, written primarily between the 12th and 13th centuries, ideally transpose this state of affairs into the legend of Arthur, adding fairy and chivalric elements. Thus, assembling the fragments of historical reality with the heroic dimension of the myth gives birth to the canonical vision of an Arthur ruling over a pacified territory where justice and the arts thrive. At this stage of the legend, the court of Camelot is regularly presented as the center of the world of chivalry. Medieval authors emphasize the exemplary nature of this kingdom. It is described in turn as a place of perfect hospitality, unfailing bravery, and the defense of the Christian faith. Great figures of literature, whether it be Chrétien de Troyes or, later, Thomas Malory in the 15th century, enjoy showing how the individual feats of each knight resonate to the corners of Europe. Princes from other lands, intrigued or even threatened by Arthur's splendor, may seek to ally with him or to challenge him. This prosperity, which can last many years in the romantic cycles, is maintained through a subtle balance between royal power, knightly loyalty, and Christian virtues. The knights under Arthur's authority ensure that justice is served, that roads are safe, and that foreign threats are contained. In return, the people support the king, value the warrior's exploits, and identify with the ideology promoted by Camelot. The idea of an exemplary kingdom has often led to comparisons with other legendary or mythological golden ages, the golden age of ancient Greece, the Pax Romana, or even the literary utopias of the Renaissance. The image of Arthur as an enlightened sovereign, surrounded by an elite united by courtesy and bravery, thus has universal significance, far transcending the borders of Great Britain alone. However, even without delving into subsequent events, one anticipates in the Arthurian tales that such perfection cannot last forever. The accumulated tensions, inevitable jealousy, and certain romantic or familial intrigues always threaten the balance of such a kingdom. Medieval authors, keen to captivate the public's attention, often played on this contrast between the brilliance of the prosperous period and the shadow that gradually looms over Arthur's figure. This dramatic tension gives the legend its depth. The court of Camelot appears all the more vibrant because it is subjected to the same passions and contradictions as any human community. To understand the continuation of the story, one must first review the key characters who gravitated around King Arthur. Over the course of the tales, Merlin takes on different roles, sometimes a prophet with visionary wisdom, sometimes a druid tied to the ancient Celtic religion, and sometimes a mage inspired by Christian faith. All these facets combine to shape a unique character at the crossroads of several worlds, renowned for his powers and wise counsel. According to some texts, Merlin was born at the end of the 5th century, or the beginning of the 6th century, when the last remnants of Roman authority were retreating from the British Isles. His birthplace varies from one version to another, with some associating him with rural areas of Wales, where the Celtic tradition remained particularly vibrant. In ancient writings, it is said that he was the son of a nun and a supernatural spirit, a narrative that highlights his semi-human, semi-magical nature. Other sources emphasize a more down-to-earth context, making him the son of a local chieftain. In any case, Merlin is by essence an extraordinary being. The role of prophet attributed to him by several legends, comes to fruition when Merlin foresees Arthur's rise to power, and later, the disunity that will follow within the kingdom. From his youth, Merlin is said to have had strange visions of the future and the ability of metamorphosis. Some texts, like those attributed to Geoffrey of Monmouth, describe Merlin as capable of conversations with animals or manipulating dreams. He quickly becomes an indispensable advisor to the Breton kings of the post-Roman era, a time troubled by the multiplication of small kingdoms and Saxon invasions. In this atmosphere of chaos and uncertainty, Merlin plays a crucial role in Arthur's accession to the throne. The stories differ on the exact way he provides his assistance, but a common point emerges from almost all versions. He watches over the child Arthur from his birth, protected or orchestrated by a magical ruse. Later, as Arthur grows up, Merlin helps him prove his legitimacy. In some versions, it is Merlin who announces the famous trial of the sword in the stone, the supreme test to identify the king chosen by Providence. In other versions, he prefers to remain in the background, but acts through advice and mysterious appearances. In all cases, his presence confers an exceptional aura on Arthur's royalty, as if the young monarch were blessed by supernatural forces. Merlin's prestige thus reflects on the new king, ensuring him the respect of the nobles and the trust of the people. However, Merlin's destiny is not solely linked to Arthur's glory. He is also renowned for his tragic prophecies. Numerous texts mention his foreknowledge of the kingdom's downfall, the rivalry between Guinevere and Lancelot, or the morbid consequences of Mordred's hatred. Merlin is said to have tried to warn Arthur, while knowing that destiny would take its course. His status as a prophet then gives him a melancholic side, aware of the inevitable outcome. One of the most poignant episodes of Merlin's legend remains his end. According to several stories of French origin, he falls in love with a fairy or a young woman named Viviane, sometimes associated with the Lady of the Lake. Entranced by her beauty, he teaches her some of his magical secrets. Fearing the extent of his power, Viviane eventually imprisons him forever, either in a cave, in a crystal, or according to other versions, in an enchanted oak tree. This disappearance puts an end to Merlin's protective influence over Arthur's court, leaving the field open to rival factions and destructive temptations. Guinevere occupies a central place in the Arthurian legend, both as queen and, in some versions, as the indirect cause of the kingdom's downfall. Her role goes far beyond that of the king's wife. In the medieval period, the queen sometimes shared important political and diplomatic responsibilities, and Guinevere is no exception to this rule. Her origin is unclear. She could be from a noble Celtic family, perhaps Welsh, or from another aristocratic lineage from the island of Brittany. In some tales, her marriage with Arthur is presented as a political pact, while in others, it is a sincere love story. Medieval texts, mainly those composing the French Arthurian cycle, notably Chrétien de Troyes and the prose romances of the Vulgate, often emphasize Guinevere's beauty and her role as a patron. The queen, surrounded by ladies-in-waiting, encourages courtliness and promotes the chivalric ideal. Under her influence, Arthur's court is adorned with subtle refinement. Jousts, tournaments, and lavish feasts are organized. Guinevere thus appears as a model of politeness and grace, perfecting the image of an ideal kingdom. However, the political dimension is not forgotten. In a time when Saxon aggressions are never far off and the unity of the kingdom remains fragile, the queen must support Arthur in consolidating his alliances. According to some authors, Guinevere would have received embassies, negotiated truces, and played a crucial role in diplomacy with the church. While these elements remain imprecise in medieval sources, they reflect the importance of a queen in the 6th century in balancing a still young and fragmented kingdom. The shadow on the picture comes from the supposed liaisons between Guinevere and Lancelot du Lac. In Chrétien de Troyes' tale, Lancelot is depicted as the perfect knight, courteous, brave, ready to die for his king and for honor. His love for Guinevere develops gradually, in a context of gallantry, typical of medieval courtly literature. The feelings first arise in secret, then become apparent through multiple adventures. This adulterous relationship, considered a sin in the Christianity of the time, threatens the cohesion of the court. According to various versions, Arthur discovers the affair in different ways, sometimes through spies, sometimes through a jealous knight. The scandal breaks out, divides the Round Table, and causes Lancelot to flee. In some French versions, Guinevere is put on trial and must be defended by Lancelot in a judicial duel. Beyond the emotional aspect, this episode undermines the king's authority just when he needs the unity of all his knights to face other threats. Ultimately, the queen finds herself, despite herself, at the center of a whirlwind that drives the kingdom toward its downfall. Some historians suggest that it is a literary metaphor, reflecting a conflict of loyalty in a feudal court where love clashes with the reason of state. An essential figure in the Arthurian legend, Lancelot, often called Lancelot of the Lake, embodies the archetype of the chivalrous knight, valiant, loyal, generous, endowed with almost unmatched strength and combat prowess. However, behind this idealized portrait lies a complex character, intimately connected to the vicissitudes of Arthur's court. His nickname, of the Lake, comes from the legendary episode in which he was taken at birth by the Lady of the Lake, sometimes associated with Viviane, into her aquatic realm. This powerful and mysterious fairy woman is said to have raised him as her own son, imparting an exceptional education to him. In addition to martial arts and the codes of chivalry, Lancelot is believed to have inherited certain supernatural graces, indicating the influence of the fairy world on his destiny. Accounts differ regarding his ancestry. Some link him to Gallic nobility, others present him as a lost child of a neighboring kingdom, but all agree in depicting him as a man destined to accomplish great things. As soon as he appears at Arthur's court, Lancelot establishes himself as an outstanding combatant. He racks up exploits in tournaments and on battlefields. In more romantic versions, he is often described as the undisputed champion, one who never backs down from adversity, defending the queen and the kingdom against anyone who dares oppose them. This exemplary bravery earns him the admiration of all, including Arthur, who considers him a true friend and a pillar of the Round Table. Yet, this image of the perfect knight is tinged with tragedy when his love for Guinevere is revealed. According to French traditions, the love arises from exchanged glances during banquets, then blossoms in secrecy, born by courtly poetry and the ideal of impossible love. In Welsh literature, the story is sometimes less developed, but the passion between Lancelot and the Queen poses an evident threat to the unity of the court. Texts oscillate between celebrating a pure and sincere love and condemning a betrayal against the king. This tension between loyalty and passion makes Lancelot a complex character. On one hand, he must respect his knightly oath to Arthur. On the other, he cannot suppress his feelings for Guinevere. Loyalty to the king, the code of honor, and Christian morality directly oppose the mad love he feels. By succumbing to this relationship, he puts himself at odds with his values. The revelation of this affair then causes a rupture within the Round Table. Lancelot is forced to flee. Some knights follow him out of loyalty to his person. Others consider him a traitor. The king, wounded in his honor, sees his authority shaken. Morgana, sometimes called Morgana the Fairy, is another key character in the Arthurian tales. Depending on the sources, she appears as Arthur's sister or half-sister, or even as a close relative determined to take revenge on him. Originally, her name likely derives from the Celtic figure Mor Regan, a warrior goddess associated with magic and battles, illustrating the blend of pagan traditions and Christian interpretations in the legend. In the early texts, Morgana is described as a healing fairy or a sorceress with remarkable talents. She often resides in an isolated place, a secluded island, a castle by the sea, or a secret valley, from where she extends her influence. Her powers are said to be comparable to Merlin's, as she practices Celtic magic, uses occult formulas, and sometimes manipulates the destiny of other characters. However, unlike Merlin, Morgana is often driven by more personal motivations, an ambition for power, a thirst for vengeance, or a desire for recognition. Her magic, tinged with esotericism, sometimes makes her a threatening figure. The nature of her relationship with Arthur is subject to controversy. In some traditions, she harbors a fierce hatred for him, born from a sense of injustice or a complicated family legacy. In others, she is hurt by the indifference Arthur shows toward her family and seeks to destabilize him. More nuanced accounts depict her as influenced by jealousy. Excluded from power or sidelined at court, she then plots to undermine the king's authority. When portrayed as his half-sister, born of the same mother but from a different father, her resentment gains even more weight, as she sometimes considers that her rights are ignored. Some versions also attribute a positive dimension to her. Morgane can be protective, especially towards certain young women at court. She is then depicted as a healer, capable of treating wounds and saving knights. Her connection to Celtic magic is not always associated with evil, but rather with an ancient wisdom that the new Christian society struggles to accept. In this respect, Morgane is a symbol of the old religion and pagan rites, which still persist in the remote areas of the British Isles. However, most Arthurian romances emphasize her role in the fall of the kingdom. She does not hesitate to manipulate Guinevere's feelings, ally with Mordred, or sow discord among the knights. In some interpretations, she even participates in revealing the affair between Lancelot and the Queen in order to deliver a fatal blow to the cohesion around Arthur. This thirst for power or revenge is coupled in Morgane with a feeling of legitimacy being ignored. Believing she is of royal blood, she sometimes feels that Arthur should not be the sole ruler. In that sense, Morgane crystallizes the family, political, and spiritual tensions that fuel the Arthurian tragedy. Among all the adversaries encountered by Arthur, Mordred stands out because the threat he embodies comes from within. Medieval accounts differ on his relation. For some, he is Arthur's nephew, son of his half-sister Morgane or his sister Anne. For others, he is the illegitimate son of the king himself, born from a forbidden relationship with a close relative. In any case, he carries within him a painful legacy, surrounded by secrets and unspoken truths, which shape his central role in the kingdom's destruction. The first mentions of Mordred depict a dark, ambitious, and calculating character. Endowed with a hot temper, he is said to have harbored, from a young age, a grudge against Arthur, accusing the king of not giving him the recognition he deserved. If one adheres to the version where he is the sovereign's illegitimate son, one can understand that he might feel rejected or considered an unworthy bastard to ascend to the throne. Over time, the latent hatred he feels turns into a thirst for power. Mordred first appears at court, sometimes as a mere knight of the Round Table, sometimes as a discreet advisor. He gains the trust of some discontented barons or potential rivals of Arthur. As he grows in influence, he seeks out flaws in the political system. The affair between Guinevere and Lancelot often provides him with the ideal pretext. By publicly revealing the queen's infidelities or orchestrating traps, he hopes to shake the king's credibility and provoke a split within the chivalry. With formidable skill, he sows discord, leading Camelot into an irreversible fracture. The climax of his rise occurs when Arthur must leave court to wage war or pursue Lancelot in exile. Taking advantage of his absence, Mordred proclaims himself regent, then king, settling in Camelot and aligning with those who feel enmity towards the legitimate monarch. In some versions, he even tries to marry Guinevere, seeking to legitimize his seizure of power. The queen flees, sometimes retreating to a fortress, sometimes joining a convent to escape the forced marriage. From a historical point of view, some specialists see in it a metaphor of family quarrels and succession struggles in the small Breton kingdoms of the 6th century. In the legend, Mordred personifies the dark shadow of power. He is the internal enemy, the one who exposes the fragilities of an ideal court. His nature as a traitor is softened in some older Welsh versions, where he does not appear as the sole culprit. Yet, the dominant tradition depicts him as the catalyst of a devastating civil war. Between personal resentment, ambition, and a thirst for vengeance, Mordred ultimately brings about Arthur's downfall. From then on, the signs of the coming fall multiply, creating an atmosphere of distrust and tension that gradually heralds the collapse of the Arthurian Golden Age. At the heart of these rivalries are the different knights, some of whom harbor personal ambitions or display previously contained resentments. The exploits that bring them to the forefront invoke admiration, but also envy. Some cast a shadow over others' influence, while others seek to establish their own renown in a world where equestrian glory and martial prowess hold prestige. Moreover, honor is a fundamental pillar of knighthood. Any insult, even supposed, can spark the flame that ignites relations among peers. In this context, the slightest misdemeanor can create a deep fracture, and group pressure creates a tense atmosphere where the smallest misstep is punished by general opprobrium. The greatest moral shock occurs with the revelation of the affair between Queen Guinevere and the knight Lancelot. The queen, supposed to embody fidelity, and the most respected knight, reputed for his devotion to Arthur, find themselves at the heart of a scandal. From a moral point of view, this betrayal strikes at the chivalric mentality, which is founded on absolute loyalty to one's sovereign. The discovery of this relationship fuels growing murmurs. Some knights are outraged, others, torn between friendship for Lancelot and loyalty to Arthur, struggle to find their side. The king's most fervent supporters see it as evidence of an irreversible moral decline, while others aspire to assert their own ambitions by exploiting the breach created by this love triangle. According to some traditions, Arthur himself initially hesitates to pursue a public trial. He wishes to maintain the ideal of harmony and refuses to make hasty accusations. However, this stance is quickly perceived as weakness, or at best as guilty indulgence towards the queen. Thus emerges a veiled protest carried by some irritated barons who believe the sovereign's honor is being tainted. The foundations of the kingdom, once solid, are increasingly shaken. The enemy is no longer just at the borders, it is now within the very heart of Arthur's court. The consequences of these initial dissensions are significant. In some versions of the story, Arthur, torn between law and his own feelings, finally resolves to accuse Guinevere of adultery, or, at the very least, to open a trial against her. Here occurs a pivotal event. Lancelot, refusing to see the queen condemned, openly opposes the king's justice, and sometimes, according to the tales, abducts her to safeguard her in his own fiefdom or in a fortified castle. But this open rebellion quickly surpasses the private sphere. Several knights, committed to the ideal of the Round Table or eager to defend the queen, join Lancelot. Others, outraged by the betrayal, rally behind Arthur, believing that royal honor takes precedence over all other considerations. Gradually, two factions form. One remains loyal to the sovereign, the other pledges allegiance to Lancelot, either because they adhere to his version of justice or because its members identify with the friendship he has forged. This duality literally fractures the chivalric order. The very principle of the Round Table, which extols unity, becomes devoid of meaning when all its knights are divided into rival camps. Civil war eventually breaks out, undermining the foundations of Arthur's power. The legendary chronicles describe raids, fratricidal battles between former comrades in arms, and Lancelot's flight to territories where he is more fortunate or better supported. The political situation rapidly deteriorates. This internal conflict distracts the king's attention from Saxon or Pictish threats and increases the vulnerability of his kingdom. The unity thought to be unalterable disintegrates, while allegiances are renegotiated under the influence of fear or opportunism. Some great noble families may use this fragmentation to regain their autonomy or demand favors from Arthur that erode his authority. It is in this troubled context that the figure of Mordred arises. In the frenzy of civil war, as Arthur sometimes leaves the court to pursue Lancelot or arbitrate conflicts, Mordred takes advantage of the sovereign's absence to seize power. He even goes so far as to claim the throne by presenting evidence, true or false, of his royal lineage. In some versions, he even claims to have been designated as a temporary regent during the king's absence, before proclaiming himself the legitimate monarch. This internal betrayal further weakens the unity of the kingdom and plunges Camelot into chaos. As discord takes root, the confrontation becomes almost inevitable. The accounts often place the ultimate battle around the years 530-540, a period which, according to some theories, coincides with historical conflicts that may have occurred in the early 6th century. Camelot is the name most frequently associated with this final clash. In the legend, it is the place where Arthur, at the head of his loyal supporters, faces Mordred and his rebellious army. Some manuscripts mention the presence in the background of Saxon troops or other enemies who, taking advantage of the civil war, would have joined the battles. But the most widespread version focuses on internal conflict. It's Arthur against Mordred in a mortal duel, symbolizing the disintegration of the Arthurian dream. Important medieval and pseudo-historical sources, such as Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britannia, depict Camelot as the fateful moment when the two armies annihilate each other. The battle rages, resulting in heavy losses on both sides. The fights are described as relentless, filled with fury and despair. Each knight knows he is fighting for his honor, and that the destiny of Great Britain is being decided on the ravaged plain. The confrontation culminates in a face-off between Arthur and Mordred, an apotheotic scene where father and son, or uncle and nephew, engage in a merciless battle. According to most versions, Mordred is killed, but Arthur also receives a mortal wound that foreshadows the end of his reign, and possibly of his life. If we compare this final battle with historical hypotheses, several researchers suggest that it could correspond to one of the many internal conflicts for the control of British regions in the post-Roman era. It is possible that Camelot is a corruption of a forgotten local place name, or the crystallization of multiple distinct battles. The conclusion of the Battle of Camelot varies according to the sources, but in most accounts, Arthur does not survive his wounds. However, the myth leaves a part of ambiguity. Rather than a definitive death, a mysterious disappearance is sometimes spoken of. This is where the Isle of Avalon comes into play, a legendary place described as a haven of peace, shrouded in mists, located outside of time, where magic remains powerful. According to tradition, Arthur, gravely wounded, is taken there by fairies or by the Lady of the Lake to be healed and preserved. Thus, the legend suggests he is not truly dead, but resting in a state of trance or sleep, waiting for the day when the kingdom might need him again. This version echoes a recurring motif in the myths of different peoples, where a legendary king, after an ultimate battle, retreats to an enchanted place, promised a potential return in times of great distress. Whether it is Avalon in the Arthurian cycle, or distant lands in other traditions, the idea reinforces the quasi-divine nature of the sovereign. In the eyes of some medieval authors, the uncertainty surrounding Arthur's death gives his reign a prophetic dimension. He is no longer a mere fallen king, but an awaited Messiah who will return at the darkest hour to restore hope to his people. From a historical perspective, this end can also be interpreted as the disappearance of a warlord around the 6th century, a pivotal moment when Breton resistance against Saxon invasions progressively waned. If Arthur embodied, for the collective memory, the last great defender of a Romano-Celtic Britannia, his fall would symbolize the end of an era. The order he attempted to build, centered around noble values, could not withstand centrifugal forces nor the advance of the invaders. The Arthurian royalty, already shaken from within, collapsed definitively when the sovereign, the pivot of unity, left behind a vacant throne and a fragmented legacy. In the centuries that follow, the potential location of his tomb or resting place fuels speculations. Glastonbury Abbey in Somerset long claimed to have discovered the tomb of the legendary king. Around 1191, under the reign of King Henry II, monks of Glastonbury allegedly unearthed a wooden coffin bearing the inscription Hic jacet sepultus in Clitus Rex Arthurus in Insula Avalonia. In Latin, here lies buried the famous King Arthur in the island of Avalon. The discovery, quickly made public, offered renewed prestige and pilgrimage activities to the abbey, whose finances were frail at the time. However, the authenticity of this finding has been questioned for centuries. Many historians see it as a religious publicity stunt, or even a fraud, intended to enhance Glastonbury's renown. Various subsequent excavations have not confirmed the actual presence of Arthur's tomb. Despite this, Glastonbury remains associated in the collective imagination with Avalon, that mythical island mentioned in Arthurian tales, where Arthur was said to be taken after his last battle to be healed or to rest. Across the British territory, Several sites yield archaeological elements evidencing battles of the 5th and 6th centuries. Fortifications have been identified as Romano-British through carbon-14 dating or stratigraphic study of sediment layers. For example, detailed examination of hill forts in the north and west of England suggests that local warlords reinforced their defenses against the Saxons. Some researchers have sometimes linked these clues to written sources extolling Arthur's great deeds. Nonetheless, no inscriptions or artifacts concretely mention his name. Archaeologists also rely on toponymic analyses, study of place names, to determine if certain localities refer to events described by Nennius or Geoffrey of Monmouth. However, the correspondences remain uncertain and subject to controversy. In the current state of knowledge, no irrefutable evidence assures that Bertilac, Camelot, or many other places described in the legend have a definite topographical reality. At most, archaeology informs us about daily life and military defense in the British Isles at that time, allowing for a better understanding of the context in which a character named Arthur might have distinguished himself. Since the 19th century, many British and European historians have sought to uncover the authentic roots of the Arthurian myth. A recurring hypothesis suggests that Arthur might have been a Romano-British war leader, active at the turn of the 5th and 6th centuries, fighting against the Saxon advance. According to this interpretation, he might not necessarily have been a king in the strict sense, but rather a general or dux bellorum, a leader of battles, recognized for his charisma and his victories, particularly at the Battle of Mount Badon, which can be placed around the year 500. This character would have inspired the chronicles of Nennius, then become endowed with marvelous dimensions over the course of oral and literary transmission. Proponents of this theory also point to Breton rulers called Arthur in later Welsh sources, noting that this name, derived from the Latin Artorius, or the Celtic Artur, was not so rare. As centuries passed, the memory of this leader would have blended with other legends, notably those of older Celtic heroes, culminating in the legendary figure that crystallizes in the chivalric romances of the Middle Ages. Some other researchers, more skeptical, consider that the figure of Arthur is purely a product of medieval imagination, a fusion of epic myths, local beliefs, and political aspirations. According to this perspective, no real individual corresponded to the epic of a victorious Arthur facing a multitude of enemies. They note that the few mentions of the name Arthur in ancient texts, for example in Nennius, are too late or too imprecise to establish a confirmed historical truth. This critical approach relies on the fact that most key elements of the legend, the Round Table, Camelot, the Grail, etc., only appear in the narratives of the 12th and 13th centuries, long after the supposed events. For these specialists, it is possible that a vaguely existing historical figure was extrapolated, but the King Arthur, we know, mainly results from the medieval writer's desire to propose a national mythology and a supreme chivalric ideal. Geoffrey of Monmouth, in particular, played a decisive role by amalgamating various sources to create a great founding story. Today, research on Arthur often lies at the crossroads of several fields: history, archaeology, philology, the study of medieval texts, and comparative mythology. When addressing the complex legacy of King Arthur and his knights, it is essential to understand how the myth continued to evolve and resonate in European culture after the first narratives. During the late Middle Ages, from the 13th to the 15th century approximately, the Arthurian myth experienced a notable resurgence of interest. Several factors explain this persistence and transformation. On one hand, the consolidation of the chivalric ideal in feudal society, and on the other hand, a very rich artistic production, particularly in tapestries and illuminations, where Arthurian heroes find a privileged place. During the late Middle Ages, Europe went through a period marked by significant political and social upheavals. Conflicts like the Hundred Years' War from 1337 to 1453 notably pitted France against England, while the Black Plague in the middle of the 14th century decimated a considerable part of the European population. In this troubled context, the noble classes aspired to reaffirm their status and distinctive values. The chivalric ideal, based on bravery, loyalty, and honesty, became an almost essential reference for princes and lords who sought to justify their power through exemplary behavior. The figure of Arthur and the epic of his knights, already widely disseminated by previous authors, proved highly useful in symbolizing this code of honor. Over the years, epics, chansons de geste, and chivalric romances highlighted significant episodes of the legend: the quest for the Grail, the brotherhood of the Round Table, or the nobility of heart of characters such as Lancelot. These stories offered a model of behavior considered ideal. To be chivalrous meant not only mastering the art of combat, but also displaying courtesy to the ladies, generosity toward the weak, and loyalty to one's suzerain. King Arthur embodies the figure of the just monarch, surrounded by loyal and valiant warriors, governed by a keen sense of honor. The literary compositions of the late Middle Ages, whether in verse or prose, often integrate direct or indirect references to the Arthurian legend. They then serve to magnify recent dynasties or those seeking legitimation by associating their lineages with the aura of the legendary sovereign. In some cases, nobles compare themselves to Arthur or Lancelot to bolster their prestige. This instrumentalization of the myth is found both in the English courts, eager to claim a symbolic lineage with a national hero, and in some continental courts, where the image of Arthur remains synonymous with enlightened royalty, unity, and chivalric splendor. The late Middle Ages saw the development of particularly refined artistic production, partly thanks to the rise of illumination in monasteries and tapestry in urban workshops. Illuminations, these manuscript paintings and decorations, adorn many prayer books, Bibles, and courtly romances. In the margins and on the initials, one often finds scenes inspired by the Arthurian legend, such as a knight battling a dragon, or a banquet presided over by a bearded and majestic king, tending to represent Arthur himself. Tapestry, much prized by princely courts, illustrates religious or chivalric themes. The most spectacular pieces can reach impressive dimensions and adorn the walls of large reception rooms, thus offering true narratives in images. The Knights of the Round Table, recognizable by their heraldic attributes, are extremely popular. Key moments of the legend, notably the giving of Excalibur, the struggle against invaders, or the discovery of the Grail, are frequently depicted in these textile works. They allow great lords to identify with a heroic episode while impressing their guests with the richness of the craftsmanship. Illuminations and tapestries, sometimes commissioned by prestigious patrons such as the kings of France, actively contribute to the dissemination and perpetuation of the Arthurian universe. In a late Middle Ages that values magnificence and refinement, these artistic representations serve as both decoration and a tool of political legitimization. According to the political tradition of the time, having the round table depicted on a luxurious medium amounts to symbolically associating oneself with the values of justice, bravery, and piety, for which Arthur is the guarantor in the collective imagination. Thus, the myth takes deeper root, transcending borders and marking all the courts of Western Europe. After the transition from the late Middle Ages to the Renaissance around the 15th or 16th centuries, history undergoes new transformations. The burgeoning humanism, rediscovery of ancient texts, and the rise of printing allow all sorts of works to circulate more widely. This movement also affects the Arthurian corpus, which will benefit from a profound renewal. In the 16th century, curiosity for Greco-Roman authors does not necessarily exclude interest in medieval works, especially when they are perceived as carrying national or regional traditions. In the British Isles in particular, there is a focus on rediscovering the figure of Arthur through bibliophilic research. Old manuscripts are unearthed, attempts are made to re-edit stories that have fallen into oblivion. The spread of printing, initiated in Europe by Johannes Gutenberg around the mid-15th century, greatly facilitates the reproduction and circulation of texts. By the beginning of the 16th century, printed versions of some Arthurian romances appear, notably in France and England. In England, scholars consider Arthur as a symbol of national identity, a founding king who would have united the people against external threats. Even though the actual existence of the character remains controversial, in the minds of many English intellectuals of the time, the historical accuracy weighs less than the strength of a unifying narrative. Historians and chroniclers then incorporate the legend into a broader historical framework, seeking to fill the gap between the end of Roman domination and the emergence of Anglo-Saxon monarchies. Arthurian texts, reconstructed or simply reprinted, fuel an emerging national sentiment and strengthen the awareness of a British uniqueness already marked by religious separation from Rome during the reign of Henry VIII in the early 16th century. The modern era, which extends in Europe from the 17th to the 18th century, gives rise to multiple debates around the legitimacy of ancient chronicles. Neoclassical authors, sometimes wary of medieval fabliaux, often propose a more rational view of literature. The Arthurian myth, tinged with marvel and fantasy, temporarily fades from the great literary scene, at least in its most epic form. However, it is not entirely abandoned. It remains present in popular ballads, collections of tales, and the oral tradition of certain regions, notably in Wales and Cornwall. Thus, even in the relative disinterest of the intellectual or artistic elite, the Arthurian flame does not extinguish. It was not until the end of the 18th century, and especially the 19th century, that we witnessed a new flourishing of the legend, the Romantic movement. The Romantics, fascinated by emotion, nature, and the idealized Middle Ages, rediscovered with passion the tales of impossible love, valiant knights, and spiritual quests. The Arthurian epics, filled with heroism, magic, and mysticism, perfectly matched their aspirations. From then on, numerous writers, poets, and painters seized upon this narrative treasure to develop their own representation of Arthur and Camelot. In England, Alfred Tennyson breathed new life into the myth with his poetic cycle, Idylls of the King, which left a deep mark on Victorian culture. The Pre-Raphaelites, a major artistic movement of the 19th century, also drew inspiration from these legends to create pictorial canvases exalting the beauty, passion, and moral nobility of the Arthurian universe. The story of King Arthur remains one of the most powerful foundational myths of Western culture. Beyond its uncertain historical origins, it embodies an ideal of justice, bravery, and unity in a world in crisis. Whether he was a real character or a literary construction, Arthur symbolizes the hope of a just king capable of uniting a divided people. This legend continues to fascinate, precisely because it blends history, magic, and timeless values. But then, did Arthur really exist? Or is he merely the reflection of our most persistent dreams?